What's up, Pastor with No Answers friends? This is Joey back at you again, and I'm excited that you're listening, especially you, Whitey. I actually got a lot out of this conversation with my friend Robbie Madison, and of course, my black brothers and sisters are welcome to listen on in, but this one is mainly for my white brothers and sisters. A few episodes ago, there was some discussion revolving around white privilege and racial inequality, and it sparked a lot of conversation. Quite frankly, made me a little uneasy, so I invited my friend Robbie to speak on that episode. So he listened to it and came on the show, and we had a good discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a couple of clips from that podcast episode, give you a chance to have some context. If you listen to all the Pastor with No Answer episodes, then you've probably already heard this. You can just fast forward right on through. But if you haven't heard the episode with John Schneider of Dukes of Hazzard, I'd go ahead and listen to these clips so you have some good context. But before we do that, I've got a gift for you. I've got a little joke. But before I tell you this joke, I'm going to just go ahead and tell you, if you got kids in the car or you're listening with your family, just go ahead and fast forward this joke, listen to it later, or you know what I'm saying? There's a little bit of language in it, all right? So this guy walks into a church office. He turns to the receptionist and he says, "Ma'am, I need to speak to your pastor, damn it." And she's like, "Oh, why would you say that way? We don't really have that kind of language in this office." He's like, "I don't give a damn what kind of language you have in this office. Please get your damn pastor so I can talk to him." She said, "Sir, you need to calm down and please don't use that language. And by the way, the pastor is unavailable." He's like, "Ma'am, go get the damn pastor." And so she's getting a little disgruntled. But around this time, the pastor in the back heard what was going on, and so he comes out there and he's like, What's up? What's going on?" The guy looks at the pastor and says, "You're the man that I wanted to see. I have a check that I wrote to the church for $50,000. Here you go." And the pastor pointed at the receptionist and said, "This damn bitch wouldn't come get me." Oh my goodness. Seacoast pastor actually told me this joke, and I wanted to give that to you all as a gift. So love you guys. Peace and love. Enjoy the episode. The sort of stuff that y'all are saying is so timely, because the interview that is forthcoming on this episode, I actually got pretty nervous about it, and you guys are helping me feel less nervous. So y'all probably aren't, y'all maybe heard of it, but I grew up with a show called Dukes of Hazzard. Mm-hmm. So it is. We
know about them Dukes of Hazzard.
Okay, I didn't know. I taught 7th grade in 2000, and people didn't know the Flintstones, so I never assumed that people know stuff.
Boomerang is a thing. We know the Flintstones.
So basically, John Schneider, he is Bo Duke, and I think this guy is extremely impressive person, just what he's accomplished. Just talking to him, I'm like, man, this guy has learned a lot, done a lot in life, get a lot about what he says. And I am going to go on the record to say I think he's a good guy, and I don't think he is a racist. We got in a conversation, and I personally think that he said some things that I would say I disagree with and I think is wrong, but I don't think saying something wrong makes you a racist. I think it makes you someone that may need to learn more, or may have said something and was misunderstood. But I think that's, and I never knew that it was called cancel culture, but that's what it is. It's like somebody says something wrong, write them off as a racist. But I will say this. So when people will hear this, and people will hear me push back a little bit, and then I realize, you know what, I just don't want to make a big thing out of this. But listen to what I did. I was like, let's talk about Tyler Perry, because him and Tyler Perry are friends. And so I immediately wanted to be like, let's let our listeners know this guy is in with Tyler Perry. But I just got a little bit nervous, and that's what I don't like. And John, you know, I want to be more like you, and Natalie, I think you're probably the same way, as just being less concerned. And I'm making some pretty big strides, but just being less concerned about what people think about me. But I hate the fact that I have to feel so careful, and I do think that the whole society is turning into something like that. It's like everybody has to be super careful because they don't want to be canceled. They don't want to be written off.
I think that is fair, but I definitely also think, and I haven't heard the interview,
right,
and I don't know that guy obviously, but I definitely think there's something to be said when like you are automatically on the defensive about a person saying they're not racist. You know what I mean? And like I definitely think cancel culture is trash, and I think there needs to be room for growth and like for explanation. But if the concern is that you're concerned that people are probably going to think this person is racist due to their remarks, is a giant red flag for me.
Sure. Well, let's get into this a little bit. So here's what it is. He basically makes a comment that, in my opinion, isn't giving African Americans enough credit for what they have to walk through. In all fairness, I do think that is what John called me out on Facebook for, again, in a very friendship-oriented way, but along the lines of, that's kind of easy for you to say, Joey. I would say that we all probably struggle with a hint of racism or prejudice or something, but I'll go on the record to say I really don't consider myself a racist by any means, but I said something wrong and John called me out on it. So that is the context of this. Is this is a guy that is buddies with Tyler Perry, buddies with a lot of black people, but I think because he's so comfortable, he's kind of like, everybody has equal opportunity. Everybody's, and just, you know what I'm saying? Like, kind of like not giving credit where credit is due as far as there is real privilege. So I think someone can have a lack of appreciation for privilege and it be ignorance, maybe,
totally,
and not racism.
I completely agree. And as the guy that did the calling out, I've had those thoughts too, because I've again walked through life as a white passing male. Like, everybody's treated me with gotten privilege. I continue to get privilege everywhere that I go, right? And I've had those arguments about black and brown people having to say everybody has access to college, everybody has this and that and the other thing, and it was coming from you're right, a place of ignorance, not a place of malice. However, I think the problem comes when people aren't open-minded to hear about and to talk through those mechanisms that are in our society that make privilege. So like, that's kind of where I find a rub, and what I find problematic are people in my life that are like, white privilege isn't a thing, period, and all of your arguments that say that it is are bogus. And I'm like, well, that's not helpful or constructive. But so that's my and I don't think that ignorance equals racism. I don't think ignorance equals this person's a racist. I'm completely in agreement with you. But again, there's a line, or there's a place where people push back on learning more and getting better and growing, and that I find offensive, and that I find to be super problematic.
Yeah. Well, it'll be really interesting. I don't know if we will get back on here and actually, maybe you guys remind me, because I would love for y'all to listen to this interview and tell me what you think. It'll be interesting. Like, I'll be curious if one of y'all is like, I can't believe he said that. But I mean, like I said, I go on the record to think, I think this guy's great. I don't think he's a racist at all. I think he sees the world through different lenses, and I think we all see things accurately and we all see things inaccurately. We don't have our stuff together, and that's just kind of where I sit with all of this.
I think to that point, man, it's silly to think that everyone has their shit together, right? It's silly to think that everyone has the answers, and that everyone's careful, and that everyone is sensitive to everyone else's plate. And I'll give the guy this: he's an older gentleman, naturally, right? So, like, if it was a younger person, I would say, hey, man, you have the internet, you have resources, and if you you care, Joey, like, you're asking people about these things. You have this podcast. You have a genuine curiosity to, like, the human condition. You know what I mean? So you're going to seek out, like, to understand. So that's, and I'm not saying that that's too much to ask from, like, an older person. But I think that is where a lot of this like weird ambiguity comes into play, is like, sure, you may be an ignorant person, but like, do you seek to understand, or are you living blatantly in this ignorance?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that becomes difficult because like people will say like, oh well, I'm friends with Tyler Perry, or I have a lot of like African American friends, so like naturally I'm not a racist.
And I'm saying that, not him, just going.
I know, I get that, yeah.
Right.
But like that's not how that works.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And I'll just say this, John, I was actually proud of myself because I went to your Facebook page and I saw where you actually address this. Like 2020 is a lot different from the early 1980s. And I remember I had the General Lee, I had figurines of you two. I think I had one of Uncle Jesse. And I mean, I grew up in an area that was pretty diverse. I had a lot of black friends. And at the time, I didn't really even know what the Confederate flag was. I didn't even have a clue. To me, it was just a cool flag.
Well, people still kind of don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
They still don't.
But today, do you ever get flack for your past role with just how, when you guys honked the horn, it was Dixie and
only
Confederate
online.
flag, and
I have that horn on several of my vehicles, and I'll never stop honking it. I do not negotiate with terrorists. I do not give into revisionist history, and I do not say something just because it's a popular opinion if I don't mean it.
Right.
And I think the notion, because I've had a lot of people say, well, I didn't know what the flag meant. You kind of said it. I didn't know what the flag meant, on the show when I was a kid. Well, that kind of implies that we did, and we slipped one over on people because this flag is the universal sign of racism. Well, it's not. It never was. We address this in Christmas cards, too, a lot. I say things like, symbols don't hurt people, people hurt people. In fact, my understanding, I've not seen it in print, but I've had several people tell me that the NAACP has actually gone on record online as saying that this flag is not a symbol of racism. So if the NAACP says it, then guess what, folks? It's probably not.
Right.
Well, I'm from New York.
It wasn't. Yeah. Wasn't there? Didn't you guys have on the show an African American policeman?
We had Sheriff Little.
What?
We had Sheriff Little. We had Dobro in the first episode. We had black folk and white folk and red folk. We had all kinds of folk, and nobody ever pointed out what color anybody was because nobody ever noticed.
Right.
I think what's happened with this whole. I like to say that it's selling division under the guise of equality. The kind of things that Al Sharpton is doing is it's an atrocity. I'm glad I'm going to have a chance to say this. I think if Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, the first thing he would do is go punch Al Sharpton right in the mouth. He has done more to divide black people and white people than any single human being on the planet, other than perhaps Obama. And it's an atrocity, especially that he's peddling his dope to young people who don't know any better. I see people who are now more aware of blacks and whites and browns and Hispanics and, oh my God, there's an Apache. People are now, because they're so afraid to say something like Apache, they're so afraid to offend somebody somewhere that now we're all, except me, obviously, we're all walking on eggshells. And when you walk on eggshells, you're not yourself. Right. So it's very difficult now for people to actually be who they are. Now we're saying, well, I'm not racist. Well, I never even considered it. I wrote a blog a couple of months ago about how I don't see racism. I don't see it at the airport. I don't see it in the restaurant. I don't see it walking down the street. I've not seen racism anywhere, perhaps because I'm not looking for it. If you look for it, you'll find it.
Yeah.
So here, buy this valve, folks. Stop looking for it. Look for people. Folks is folks. There are no black folks. There are no white folks. There are no African Americans. There are many, many white people that came from Africa who are by definition African Americans. But if you try to wave that flag, somebody will shoot you. They'll shoot. I don't mean they'll shoot you bang. They'll shoot you down. They'll ridicule you. But why is it not true?
Yeah.
Someone from Africa who is an American, we're not saying what color they are. We're saying they're from Africa and they're an American.
Right.
I have one I wrote a script called The Fairway, and I have a gay couple, a black man and a white man. They're both mechanics, and and the white guy is from Africa.
Yeah. And
so in the couple, my Christian friends, of course, love that whole notion, but still, why not? I mean, I love people. Folks is folks, like I said. So in their relationship, they get a kick out of saying, hey, point out the African American in the room. And of course they point to the black guy, and they're wrong because he's from Cleveland. Right. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
So folks, if that hasn't just turned your world around, then get a hold of my book and watch some of my movies.
Yeah, absolutely. You got me interested for sure. I think we could do a whole episode on what you said about Obama. I'm a little hesitant to get into that because I know your time is limited. But one thing, I guess I would call it a little bit of pushback is, like, I agree with you as far as not looking for it and that sort of thing. But like, for example, a close buddy of mine, he was telling me the things that he has to think through as a black male that I do not have to think through. Like, for example, getting pulled over by a cop. He's constantly thinking, okay, am I safe? Is the shit going to hit the fan here, sort of thing. Another guy told me that basically he actually teaches his sons, if you get pulled over, you basically immediately tell the cop, I'm coming from such and such. I'm going to such and such. Here's my license. And I mean, that was so eye-opening for me. I was like, I would never even think to teach my boys that, So do you think part of it would be maybe there's stuff that you and I just don't know because we are white dudes?
I'm sure there is. But I would love to ask your friend the question: Would he feel just as uncomfortable if the cop were black?
Yeah,
and I would think the answer is yes. So that it's not a white on black thing. It's not a race thing. It's a cop on civilian thing. Whenever I get pulled over, I've been pulled over in a long time. But what I do is I either I roll my window down and I put both my hands on the side of the car. I want the gentleman or woman, black, white, or yellow, or red, to see both of my hands. Yeah, I do that. I've always done that.
Right.
So I don't know. I'd heard that before. But I don't know if there really is any truth to that unless it depends on where you are. Right. There are terrible parts of every municipality. And it's not just because people say, well, that's racist because you're obviously talking about the black parts. No, I'm not. There's white trash parts of towns that you wouldn't want to go into either.
Yeah.
There just are. So if you're a man or a woman, black, white, doesn't matter, in a uniform going through that neighborhood, or you just heard that I tell you what, if I was running through, jogging through the black part of town, if there is such a thing anymore, what is Michelle talked about white flight? I don't believe that's true either. And and some white guy had just robbed a liquor store and I was jogging through the neighborhood, chances are I'd be treated the same way.
Gotcha.
I think it's a situational thing. I don't believe that people are nearly as universally well, they are now because of this. That's why I say it's division under the guise of equality. My God, there was a mixed racial couple on the Jeffersons. That was 45 years ago. Have we not come any? You know, there's the proof in the pudding right there. Is I think we were more diverse. We were more less aware of our skin color 45 years ago than we are today. So what direction are we really going?
Now that's an interesting thought. I mean, I would say a lot of people would be that, but we're also talking barely removed from segregated schools, for instance. But gosh, that's an interesting thought. That really is interesting.
Well, battle. I don't think the battle. I think the battle was fought and won brilliantly with the blood of many, many innocent people. To continue fighting a battle after people have died to win it is doing a disservice to those who died to win it. To be able to make division something that puts money in your pocket, something that puts butts in your seats, something that keeps you on television, I think God does not smile at that.
Now, what about the real racism though that exists? Like, what I mean,
on which side you're talking about? White racist or black racist?
I guess
all
racist?
Of it. Well, I guess all of it. It's going to be human nature. Human nature is there's an us and them. Really, I don't believe that there is a black-white race issue. I don't think color has nearly as much to do with race. I'm sorry, with prejudice as social standing or financial standing do. I do believe there is an untrusting a division between wealthy people and poor people. And what's the old thing they say? Everybody has two things they agree on about rich people is they all hate. Nobody trusts rich people, and they all want to be one. But in that is not implied rich white people or rich black people or rich red people or rich yellow people. It's rich people. So I do believe there is a division there. But that's a division that we live in a free country. We're able to we're all able to try to do better. And I think now, especially now, because there's so much opportunity now, a lot of people are trying to do better. We're getting rid of many systems that encourage people to try to either do nothing or do worse so they can get more money.
All right. So these are the kind of episodes I like, man. I'm sitting here with a friend, not a author that I don't know, even though those can be kind of fun too. But so Robbie, it's funny, when I texted you, I felt like I needed to just be very straightforward that, hey, I'm texting you to talk about something that has to do with black people and racism. Because I don't know, it seemed I could see how podcasting could, if they're not careful, can always call the black guy when it has to do with race. You know, you've been on this show talking about your involvement with the New England Patriots, like leading them in worship and talking about your music and all that stuff. But I just wanted to make clear, I was like, Robbie, we're going to talk about black stuff and racism and white privilege and all that sort of thing. But basically the context for you listeners, if you want to go back and listen to episode 215 with John Schneider, guy from the Dukes of Hazzard, I basically started the episode with my two co-hosts explaining how I got really uncomfortable at the end of the interview with John, and I felt like basically I don't think that he's a racist, but I was really uncomfortable with his posture with racial equality, white privilege, and that sort of thing. And so obviously that set the listeners up to listen for that. But so Robbie, I asked you to listen to all that stuff, and there's some deeper things here that this question may come across a little silly sounding, but I'm after something. Like how do you feel as a close friend of mine when I say I really, really like John Schneider a lot? Like, I loved that interview. I thought he was very likable. I was intrigued by the stuff that he's doing with his life, and I've obviously clearly communicated how I didn't agree with, but how does that sit? Because I'll leave it there. How does that sit well with you? Does that sit well with you? I love that guy. I thought he was awesome.
Well, I would just say that now I think you're a racist. And so I'm just playing. No, I mean, I think that I actually really like John Schneider too. I mean, I totally agree. Even after listening to the interview, it was quite challenging listening to certain parts of it that I just don't agree with.
Right.
There's a lot of things in there that I don't agree with, but I also just love John Schneider, and I am a huge comic book fan. And one of my favorite superheroes is Superman, and he was Clark Kent's dad in Smallville.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, I watched every episode, all 10 seasons, 10 years worth.
I had someone reach out to me and say, "Please tell me you asked questions about Smallville." And I was like, "I don't know anything about Smallville." So it has to do with superheroes?
Yeah, it's basically Superman growing up. It starts with him in high school, and then it's him becoming a man. And one of his biggest influences was John Schneider, who played the character of Jonathan Kent, Clark Kent's dad. And so he actually, not to ruin it, but he dies like maybe in like season 5 or something like that, and it's terrible. It's like, it's like so heart-wrenching, but you always just remember him. So yeah. Anyway, like all that to say is that,
and the reason why I asked that question about how, because I can anticipate, I think, how you would answer this, but we do live in a culture now to where if someone says something that is off-putting about something like racial equality and white privilege, it almost feels like now you're supposed to not like them, not paying attention to them, never watch another Dukes of Hazzard episode again.
Right. Well, I think that actually just sets yourself up to think that you're the definition of perfection.
Right.
Like, you always say the right things. You always have the final authority on things. And I don't think that that's the correct posture either. I think that we all live in a fallen world where sometimes we can just have some things about our perspective that's off until we encounter someone from maybe the opposing perspective, or someone who can challenge our thoughts, have conversations with us, and we just continue to grow and evolve in that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. All right. So the $1 million question for me, at least, were you disappointed in my lack of pushback?
No, not at all.
Because you could tell that, like, you could tell that I was uncomfortable.
Right.
But I really, that's the thing about podcasting, is it's just a tough. It's I feel like in a digital sense, I've got a guest in my house.
Right.
And a guest that I've never met before. And he says something, and people expect you to just jump all over his case. Right. But at the same time, I understand too that podcasting is supposed to be, in my opinion, honest, conversational, and all of that. But it just, I felt uncomfortable with just keep pushing at it, because I didn't know where it would go, and that wasn't necessarily the point of the conversation. But I'll be honest with you, when I re-listened to it, I was disappointed in myself. Like, I felt like I could have pushed back a little bit more. I mean, and like when he made the Obama comment, for instance, of being one of the most divisive people in our country, like I had to mention that I felt, because I at least wanted him to realize, whoa, I didn't really sit well with that. I said, man, we'll have to talk about that another time or something like that. But
for sure,
I think I could have pushed back a little further.
Well, I mean, like you said, I don't know if that was necessarily the point of the conversation either. And I think that part of the role as an interviewer sometimes is to allow the guest to share their opinion, and not necessarily to persuade their opinion unless that's the point of the show. Right. And I don't think that that's necessarily really been your point. And I think that when it comes to sharing your view and your perspective on things, I think people have been able to kind of gather that. who you are
Right.
and your perspective on that. And I thought you did a really good job just kind of respecting, but also creating space and creating room, because if you come and combat someone who has had a lifetime of perspective that may be kind of off, that they're already really settled in it, you're probably not going to get anywhere in a 20-minute conversation online. So what you'll end up doing is not being as informed as you could have been, with just opening the door, asking probing questions, and asking them questions that might get them to think about something else.
Yeah.
Like your question of, he made the comment with like Sanford and Sons, how there was like a multiracial person or a multiracial couple or something like that on the show. And he said that they were less racist. He said they were less racial. And then he said they were less color aware or something like that on the show back then. And you said, that's interesting because it was actually pretty close after desegregation of schools,
Right.
which I thought was like a valid point, you know, like, and that was a great response to that, because that is a reality that that you can easily ignore, especially when you're watching a TV show, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of my favorite tweets that I've ever seen, and I forgot who the guy was now, but he basically said, in quotations, yeah, we need to go back to the good old days when prayer was in school, end of quotation. And then he says, yeah, like when the blacks weren't there. Oh. And I'm like, that is so true. It's like people are so quick to say, man, we just got away from God, and there's no prayer in the public schools. Got away from God. We had prayer in the public schools, but didn't see black people as our equals.
Right.
Come on, crazy.
It's like pretending
stuff.
like everything else was right.
Yeah. So what, kind of getting into the meat of the conversation, how do you feel, because I was trying to make sense of it in my head, how do you feel about me basically saying I truly, and before I say I truly don't believe John Schneider is a racist, I don't believe that, but I do believe we all have prejudices. I don't think anyone can free themselves of that completely. Right. That's a different thing than racism. Can I say, like, Robbie, is it possible that I am not racist at all, or would racism be kind of in the same category of how I just described prejudice? Like, do we all have prejudices, and do we all have hints of racism, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually probably say that racism is a subgroup of prejudice.
Okay.
Because racism definitely it refers to their ethnic makeup. It's a prejudice against their ethnic makeup, culture, and background. Versus prejudice can be against anything. It could be prejudice against fat people, or prejudice against poor people or rich people or whatever. And we all have those.
Did you just say fat, man?
I did.
You're supposed to say weight challenged. Or
if somebody's prejudiced, they're going to say fat. I'm just playing. Yeah, so we all have different biases. It could be anything, but when it comes to race, there are lots of things that we're just more comfortable with. And some of that it doesn't necessarily have to be from a negative to positive kind of perspective. It could just be about exposure. Like, for example, as a child, like if you only have, I say this a lot because I've received this a lot. I have a lot of friends that their children have only been around white people.
Right.
So a black person comes up to their child and then they're just like, what happened to that person? It's like, when you go to, when a white person goes to Africa, to a remote village for the first time, and the African children are just like, what happened to this guy's skin? Like, this guy has no skin, because they haven't seen a white person before.
Yeah.
And so that is not necessarily positive or negative. It's just about exposure. And I think that when racism becomes a factor, it becomes when we attach negative and positive to the qualifiers of these. So I think that I really think that's the case, really. And some of that is influenced by the way that we're raised, or comments that are made growing up, or, I think there's just so much more, psychologically speaking, to be considered when we're talking about the issue of racism.
Right. So is there such thing as like neutral racism? And what I'll give an example of that. I've said before, and it comes across, I don't know how it comes across, but I legit really enjoy the typical company of black people in the South.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is a different culture.
Right.
Like if you and there's all obviously exceptions to everything. Like I know that I had a friend in high school. All he wanted to do was hang out with white people, so he tended to be more like white people. But typically in the South, if you get around a bunch of black people for a family reunion or something like that, like I really do enjoy that race of people. Like
the culture, the subculture. Yeah.
So is that a neutral racism, or you wouldn't even call it racism?
I wouldn't call it racism. I would just call it. You could call it racial bias.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But I think that a part of that is kind of redefining our perspectives now, because one thing that I hear when I listen to John talk about racism, he wouldn't have agreed with your statement, because what he said is that there's no such thing as a black person, there's no such thing as a white person, there's no such thing as race. We make it all up in our head and we look for it and we exploit it. And I think that that's very incorrect. But I think what it is our parents' and grandparents' generation, I really do believe that it was partially their solution to the race problem was to do what's called colorblind, like to have a more of a colorblind perspective. I've heard my parents say it. I say, I'm not racist, I'm colorblind.
I don't see color.
Right. And I heard John say that over and over again in that. But the problem with that is that now you're devaluing the fact that there are cultures and that cultures just don't matter anymore, that there's no influence from culture. Instead of having that perspective, I think maybe it's more beneficial and more loving if we look at a person and celebrate their diversity. We celebrate their culture, because not all black people are the same, not all white people are the same, not all Hispanics are the same. We actually celebrate that culture. And in turn, as human beings, we grow when we allow ourselves to learn from situations, to learn from history, to not repeat the negative things and maybe celebrate those positive things that actually propel our culture forward, so that we can stop calling people red and yellow. I was really confused by that. Like, what is a red person?
Right.
What is a yellow person?
Right.
And racism in America is not just about black and white, either. And we always focus, partially because we're in the South, we focus so much on white and black. And I do believe that that's a major factor in America. But we don't talk about Hispanics,
right?
When we have certain political figures that make statements that are extremely insulting to different Hispanic cultures, like Puerto Ricans are the worst.
Certain political figures. I love it.
One of the quotes I saw was, Puerto Ricans are the worst kind of Mexican.
Gracious.
And it's like, we don't think about that sometimes because it becomes overshadowed because it's such a white-black culture here.
Right.
But it's like, what do you think about all of the Hispanic countries and singling out those two? Number one, you're devaluing the identity of Puerto Ricans, but you're also making the identity of Mexicans so negative that you're using it as an insult to a whole nother country and culture.
Yeah.
And it's just like, where have we become? Like what have we become? How far have we gone?
Yeah.
We've distorted things so much.
So when someone says that whole, I don't see color, I'm colorblind, it sounds like two things are happening. First of all, you're missing out on highlighting the great things about culture of a particular race. And also you are not lending credibility to the real struggles that a black guy walking down the street has that I don't have.
Yeah. And then, honestly, I was talking to my wife about this too, which, my wife is half Caucasian, half Filipina.
Right.
And so she's got different cultures at play right now, and her whole life she's definitely received a lot of criticism, even growing up in schools. I mean, she even had a story about how in her class, she was the only brown one in her class, and her teacher said to the whole class that people should not mix, like couples should not mix. And she, as a mixed race person, felt completely embarrassed and devalued in front of her classroom of peers of white people.
What age was that?
This was, I think,
middle?
high school, or it was either high school or middle school.
And was it a Christian school or just regular public?
I think this one was just a regular public school.
Yeah.
They did grow up going to a Christian elementary school, though, I think. So, sorry, I'm looking at my phone. I'm trying to pull up a picture for you that I thought about when I heard the podcast as well.
Yeah.
Just thinking of, I think that the whole colorblind mentality is, in some perspectives, it can be white privilege. When someone like John says that he doesn't see color, he never saw color, he chooses not to do that. He chooses not to see racial things that happen in America. And, anybody who brings attention to racial issues is dividing people, like Al Sharpton and Barack Obama and, stuff like that. Like that can be white privilege. And the reason why I think that is because when you haven't actually experienced something for yourself, you can tend to have a naive perspective on it. And that is okay. I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But when you begin to communicate absolutes for a group of people based off of your experience, I think that is something that's arrogant.
Yeah.
It's arrogant. And so...
Yeah, it's like, I can assess this situation accurately.
Right.
No, you can't.
Right.
You can't.
Exactly. You don't have the factors. So tell me what this photo is. Describe that for me.
I am imagining that is a ship of slaves, and there are darker slaves, lighter skinned slaves. They're all... Why are you showing me this? This is crushing me.
Yeah.
But tied up.
What's around their legs?
Chains.
Do you see anything on their legs, like on their skin?
Marks.
You see marks and bruises,
Right.
things like that. And then also similar photo.
Right.
What do you see there?
A bunch of, I'm pretty sure, all African American, or I guess at this point Africans.
Yeah.
They're all chained, and it looks like maybe even chained together. Yeah.
Barely clothed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Trying to think. I thought I took one more. I mean, I have a couple other photos, but I think you're starting to get my point here. There was one other quote from, I think it was Harriet Tubman, maybe, that I wanted to share. I'll have to look it up and share it with you later. But it basically talks about, like, when you hear the sound of the dogs, make sure that you keep running. And it's like referring to, the blacks that were trying to escape, and they literally had dogs running after them to attack them, to bite them, rip off their flesh. Like, these are graphic things. Like, these are graphic stories, but it's not something that's made up. It's a really recent part of our history. And so if you were to look at one of those people and you were to say to them that there's no difference between black and white, that there's no difference between African American, if you looked at one of those people and you said that, it would start an argument if I brought up that this white guy is from South Africa.
Right.
Like, that's not the same thing. None of that is the same thing. And then, you think about it like, I know that my niece, and I parent my niece, and I remember, I think it was last year, doing a parent-teacher conference, like, I had some teachers say some things about my niece that was not true. It did not align with her identity as a person. Like, not about her behavior, but her identity as a person. That grieved me.
Right. Can you share that or not really?
No, I mean, not necessarily. Like it was like attitude adjustments and things like that, and like their perspective of like how they don't care and they have a mean spirit and all these different things, right? And I didn't agree with it. Of course, I had conversations with these teachers and I was grieved by this, right? That's just my niece or my adopted daughter here. Like, can you imagine if somebody said something about your mom, you know, like somebody like insulted your mom, and not just insulted her, but told her that she was worth nothing, told her that she was unintelligent, told her that she was they referred to her as a nigger, or, you know, if they were white, referred to her as a dumb cracker,
Right.
or a honky, told her she was worth nothing. Maybe, you know, like, what if your mom was made to not only have sexual relations with a slave master, but also, you know, made to nurse the slave master's children and starve their own children, you know, like things like that, you know, like if you think about that, like how offended would you be? Like, what would your perspective be of your mother? Would you grow up with happiness and cheer and with thoughts of unity? Or would you actually be offended and think, I will never, ever let anybody treat my mother this way ever again?
Right.
And you think about that, and you think about your grandmother, and you think about your grandfather, and all those things, and think about your grandparents in chains, not clothed, not able to see a doctor or get, you know, normal health care or become a movie star or anything like that. Like, you think about what you think their lives should look like, or maybe the romanticized view of what we think their lives looked like, and then you replace that with what slavery looked like. A recent history of slavery. People who were denied education, they were denied employment. There wasn't employment. They were dehumanized. They were treated as property. They were whipped. They were bruised. They were killed. They saw their relatives killed that they could do nothing about it. They literally had to starve their own children, and then they were asked to have a good attitude about it.
Yeah.
You know, and that is very different. It's one thing if a teacher says something bad about my niece, but at the end of the day, I know that I can take my niece home and I can reinforce who she is. And I know that she has the rights to education if she works really hard for it. And I know that, yeah, definitely she might have a harder time because people will view her in a certain way that don't want to necessarily appreciate where she came from. They'll just put her in a specific category or whatever. And I know that I have to teach her to overcome that. But, you know, 100 years back, that wasn't the case.
Right.
I mean, my grandfather was born in 1917. That was my granddad, 2 generations up.
Right.
You know, times were very different for him.
Right.
And so all that to say, like,
I mean, and that's so important what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
Your grandfather, 1917. Do you know how jacked up things were for black people in this country in 1917?
And he fought in World War II.
Right.
You know, like, it's just crazy. And I really appreciate my grandparents, but at the same time, like, I know that some people were way more hurt than they were, you know? Like, my grandfather, I was so proud of him because he's never, ever communicated to me anything negative about white people. Like, now, my grandma, I won't say that she communicated anything negative, but she worried about me a lot.
Yeah.
I have distinct memories from when I was first starting school, 5-year-old kindergarten, 6-year-old kindergarten in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And I would come home from school so excited because, you know, school was great and I'd waited a long time to start since my older cousins were already there and my older sister. And I'd come home and she'd be like, hey, baby, how was school? And I said, no, school was great. Did you make a lot of friends? Yeah, I made a lot of friends. They were so nice. Were there white people there? Yeah, there were lots of white people there. Were they nice to you? Yeah, of course they were nice to me. You know, and then she would just like stop asking about it at that point, but she would always check on me. And it took me a long time to realize why she was doing that. She had terrible experiences growing up. She was mistreated by a white family that she worked for, you know, and there were lots of really terrible things. I mean, she had children when Martin Luther King was, you know, fighting for civil rights. And my mom tells me, like, she has vivid memories of her sitting in front of the TV, blood curdling, screaming, watching people, you know, in Selma and watching people, you know, get beaten and thrown from diners and killed, you know. It's a very different reality. I can't say that everyone's grandparents had that tone and they're raising children with that tone of, we fought for this. Like, we really there's something that I accomplished and I want a better future. I'm trying to imagine a better future because I haven't been able to see it around me. I'm trying to imagine it and have faith and build something different for my children and for my grandchildren.
Right.
Like that's very different.
Right.
You know?
So what you were saying about reflecting on what grandparents went through and everything, it made me think, and I've said this publicly on a podcast, that my grandfather was a racist, and not in a way of, well, all of us have a little bit in them. No, he was a racist. Like he had a lot of bitterness and hatred towards Asian people, black people. And what does Joey say about my deceased grandpa? I say, that's still my grandpa.
Yeah.
He's my family.
Right.
I love my grandpa. Don't see eye to eye at all. Not proud of where what his posture was. But here I am saying that about my grandpa, who was a racist. And what you just depicted, as far as you're reflecting on a grandparent that could have been beaten in the street or killed. I mean, Abraham Lincoln set people free, but that really didn't mean anything a whole lot. I mean, that's, and you actually have helped me understand a lot, because I think what a lot of people would say to what you just said and the pictures that you just showed, well, yeah, but now we're in 2020. I mean, first and foremost, it should clue people in on the fact that, yeah, but Robbie's grandpa was born in 1917. You have to know what he went through, and that's just 2 generations. So that means that your mom or dad could tell you direct, like if your grandpa didn't tell you, your parents could tell you direct things that he went through, and that's your family. You know, that's who you love. And so, so that's one thing. It seems like it should just be a given. People should be able to understand that. But you've helped me understand. And I mentioned you to John Schneider, not by name, but I was saying how, I have a friend that he has a completely different perspective of being pulled over. Like I get pulled over, I'm like, damn it, I hope I don't get a ticket. Right. You get pulled over, and how do you feel?
Well, there's a lot of anxiety that happens, and that's experiential. And I've lived in other places. It's not like I've only lived in Charleston. You know, like in Charleston, of course, is a hub for slavery. Charleston, has a rich culture. My family has very close ties with the ministry of Emmanuel, Emmanuel Church, where the shooting was. I think my great-great-grandfather was one of the former pastors there. Like, I grew up going to church downtown Charleston, But I also lived in South America. I lived in other places, and it's interesting because in South America, walking through the streets at 2 and 3 in the morning, if I encountered cops there, it didn't give me the same feeling as when I encounter cops here in the States. And I know that John did say that it's not a black-white thing. That's also an absolute or generalization, and that's not true, because it is a black-white thing, especially nowadays. Like, I think that when he talks about walking on eggshells, how people are walking on eggshells and that's not allowing them to be free, I think that there's a difference between being free and being respectful and being loving towards people. Sometimes, just because, like, if I grew up calling, saying, oh, this is my honky or cracker friend Joey, like if I grew up saying that, like, and we went into a group of people that didn't receive that the same way that me and you did that, and I did that to you and disrespected you and devalued you with terms that, number one, don't accurately describe you, but number two, just because of habit or not wanting to walk on eggshells, if I said that to you, like, that's not loving. Right. That's not even walking on eggshells. That's just disrespectful, And so I think that eggshells, or just having tact when you're speaking to people, I think that that's important, because you don't need to be walking around calling people nigger because, before it was okay, right, or before it was cultural or anything like that, All that to say, like, I think it's a perspective shift. I grew up in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, which is a different place now than it was when I grew up, which is not that long ago.
It's like Mount Perfect now, and if you've seen the Truman Show, a lot of people see it in that light.
Yep, they call it Mount Plastic now.
And it's funny, you and this may be what you're about to say too, but when Mount Pleasant is depicted that way, you're like, I grew up in Mount Pleasant, and I didn't grow up in a neighborhood like that. Like, this isn't just this white
Right.
utopia.
Like, it was a town, like Charleston in general, but Mount Pleasant was a town that if you grew up there, you had a family name, and people knew your family name. If they didn't know you, they knew your family. And so everything was close from generation to generation. My grandparents had a house there for 70 or 80 years, same place, and we all grew up there. Like generations grew up there. I felt safe in Mount Pleasant for my whole life. Meanwhile, 6-7 years ago, when I moved back to Charleston, started dating my wife, who is white and Filipino. She's, she went to school downtown, and she's not from Charleston, but she's new to Charleston, and we would go to dates, and of course I would take her to dates in my hometown, and I just remember one night particularly, I went to the Bell Hall Shopping Center. We had pizza, we hung out. It was a great night. And then we sat in my car, and I kissed her goodnight. Pretty much immediately when I kissed her goodnight, I got flashlights shining into my car. So I put my window down because it was a police officer searching my car, leans over me and asks her if she's okay.
Wow.
And I'm like, this is my hometown. Asks her if she's okay, Another place in Mount Pleasant around the corner, I pulled into.
You kissed her.
I kissed her goodnight. My girlfriend.
Right.
Not some random girl that I stole off the street.
Right.
And
there's obviously no sign of her trying to get out of the car.
Not at all. Her car was right next to mine. And it's actually, I think that happened actually to us no, it didn't happen to us one more time, but she became so paranoid anytime that we were out
How'd
in
you
public.
respond? I mean, it seems like the look on your face had to be obvious to the cop, like what? And like,
right.
How did you respond to that?
I don't fight with cops. I'm very respectful with cops because there's no arguing, there's no arguing with them. I've gotten some really, like, it sounds like John and a lot of other people get some really pleasant experiences with cops, but I've gotten called stupid before by cops. I've gotten called a liar by cops. I don't have necessarily positive experiences, a plethora of positive experiences when I'm pulled over. I have an experience where they're trying to evoke fear, and I understand that that's a part of their job, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be necessarily that way, especially in a place where blacks are fearful for their lives. I mean, just I think this was maybe last year. I was at my cousin's house, and my cousin was driving home. Her son, he was driving home in the neighborhood, and there was a cop following him. He was terrified. Of course, in his mind, he's like, if I can just make it home, then I'll be okay. I'm in the driveway seeing this happen. I'm like, he's driving like literally 10 miles an hour or whatever. He pulls in front of the house and he doesn't move. He just pulls in front of the house. The cop is behind him. My cousin, his mom, comes out of the house yelling his name, and I tell them to stop. His two brothers walk out of the house, and his grandma, my aunt, they all walk out of the house, and I tell them, stop. I yell at them. I said, stop moving. Of course, his mom didn't care. She went up to the car. The other boys, especially the boys, I told them, stop moving. Do not get any closer to the car. Because then the police officer called for backup, called for two other cop cars to come over. Turns out that my cousin's music was too loud driving down the road, so he needed to follow him and pull him over because his music was too loud.
Oh, wow.
And so it took all of that. It took 3 cop cars to tell him that his music was too loud. But I had to stop my cousins because we're living in an age and a city where there is police brutality, where people are literally killed because of a misunderstanding or misplaced fear. You shouldn't really respond with fear like that, because then sometimes fear can make you irrational. It can make you make decisions on things that aren't really true. It's things that your mind has made up in your head,
Are you more? Would you be more comfortable if you got pulled over and a black cop comes up to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, if I was breaking the law, I was breaking the law, but it's not just about that anymore.
Right.
It's not just about breaking the law. Yeah, everybody, people make it seem like that. They make it seem like I'm mad because I was speeding. It's not about that. I'm mad because when I'm taking my brother home and I go through a speed trap and I'm like, oh man, I can't believe I let myself get above the speed limit here. My brother starts recording on his phone because he doesn't know if I'm going to be alive at the end of the encounter. He shouldn't be thinking about that, you know, but that's the reality of where we are, and we can't ignore it. We have to actually deal with it. We have to actually we have to communicate. We have to, number one, have better accountability with police officers, but that also needs to be publicly communicated because we're all operating in a state of fear. Cops are operating in a state of fear, and people are operating in a state of fear, and none of that is going to produce anything good.
Right.
All that's going to do is put people on the defensive, like on each side, when really, if we want it to get back to the point where I'm thinking, oh, I just was speeding, he's probably going to give me a ticket, then let's get some positive media. Let's get some positive interactions, you know, to actually show that. Like, let's show some support. That's one thing that our government doesn't show at all is support. You know, when it comes to negative things that happen to minority communities, there's not a message that it's wrong. Like, they don't say anything about it. They just ignore it, or they get mad that people got mad about it. How are you going to get mad if somebody slaps you in the face? What am I supposed to tell you? Don't get mad about it.
Right.
Like, you got to be okay or whatever. Like, you're always getting mad when people slap you in the face. Like, what?
Right.
Like, of course people are going to get mad.
Right.
Like, when you shoot a little kid, people are going to get mad, and you have to allow them to be angry about that because it's not right.
Right. And it goes back to Joey Svendsen does not understand what it feels like to live in a society where I'm the minority and there's this other color of people that don't go through what I go through.
Right.
I mean, I can't put your mind inside of mine. Mm-hmm. So I just need to listen to what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, what do you think is when you think of the comments in the episode that we're referring to, do you see him as just ignorant, and or is it dangerous ignorance? And I'll remind you of these questions since I'm throwing so much at. What's the motivation? Why are people so motivated to make sure people see no, we all have the same opportunities? You're doing black people an injustice for making an exception, because part of it comes across as like a positive, right. Hey, I see, I don't look at a black person and think anything differently. We all have the same art. So it comes across as, man, this is great. We're just all equal. But what's the motivation there to make sure everybody believes there's no inequality, there's no such thing as white privilege?
Right. I mean, I think some of that I think a lot of it is ignorance, for sure. I think that some of it is wrong ignorance, like offensive ignorance. But I also think that ultimately, I also think that some of it is it's a defense mechanism. People feel bad, or they feel offended, or they feel angry, and they're just like, well, I didn't do anything to you, and I didn't do anything towards the black race, so why do I need to pay for something? Why are you holding on to things and making me pay for it? And some of that perspective, I understand that. I understand, some of that too, because sometimes my perspective is this: respect the history and promote a better history. That's for every single race. That's not just for white people. That's for black people too, because I'm in the education field as well. And I'm constantly meeting, young students that grow up angry. And that's, it's okay to learn your history and to learn your culture. But when you get to a place of anger, then I want to ask you, why are you angry? Why are you angry? Who has offended you? Who told you that? What is the actual reality, and what are you doing about it? Because what happens is people get partial, they get in process, and then they stop. It's okay to be angry, but what are you going to do with that? Like, if you're angry about something, like, you need to be a part of the solution, or at least encourage the solution, and not just sit in anger and wait for somebody else to do something to fix it for you and to fix it for all of your people. What are you doing about it for yourself and for your people? And I say that to young students all the time. I'm like, it's not enough to just be an angry black person. Like, you have to change it.
Right.
To be anger just produces more anger. Like, all that is going to do is produce more anger, and then you're going to go nowhere. You're just teaching your children how to be angry and to not actually accomplish anything, but to sit there and to live in a life victimized.
Yeah.
Yes, it's true that terrible things happen and terrible things still happen today, but it is also true that we have freedom and that we don't have to let these things hold us back.
Right.
And I think that, it's the same thing. I think that with John and with people with that same perspective, I really do think that it comes from a relatively good place. I think that they just want this stuff to be over. They want people to live at peace, and they're just like, stop bringing race into this. Let's just chill. Let's all just get along and stuff. And I think that is that he was in the process at one point, and at one point he just stopped. And I think a lot of people do that. As we get older, it's easy to do that. It's easy to just be like, well, back in my day, they didn't allow cell phones in school, so we just learned more. And it's just like, well, that's cool. But at the same time, my brother has more access to information than I ever did. Like, there's some positives in each generation.
Yeah.
We can pause on the negative, and then we hold on to what life was like 20 years ago or 30 years ago or whatever. And then we hold so firm to it that we're not even open to, oh, maybe they actually created a better solution. Maybe it is better to just eat healthier,
right.
Eat more vegetables. Maybe there is something to nutrients and vegetables that, maybe it's not just a millennial thing, or, whatever the issue is. And so with race, I think it's the same thing. Like, I think it's just an old perspective, and I think that he's kind of paused there and doesn't move forward. I don't even know how much of it he's convinced himself of. Like, I think some of it is just stuff that he's said for years.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And what do you think about this? And I know there's exceptions to all of this sort of thing, but as far as just going back 2 generations to our grandparents, my grandma passed away a couple years ago, and her and grandpa, they're both deceased now. They lived on property that's prime property on James Island. James Island's a very expensive place to live in Charleston, and here they have property that can be sold as commercial real estate.
Yeah.
So when that property is sold, my dad and my uncle are going to get a huge chunk of change, and I know for a fact that there's a high likelihood that my brother and I will get a chunk of change from my dad, which will very likely have some sort of impact on my children.
Right.
And I would imagine there's probably a lot of those sorts of situations, or at least more situations like that. And currently in 2020, I'd have to assume that sort of scenario is more common in white families than black families.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't understand why people can't see the systemic racism and how it still has effect right now.
Right.
It just seems that it should be an obvious thing.
Right. Absolutely. And you really hit the nail on the head with that one. That's the whole topic of inheritance. When you have generational inheritance, like, somebody brought this to my attention not too long ago, actually. I just never even thought about it. But white culture has had inheritance happening for years and years and years. Their families have had things to pass down. Their families not only had things to pass down, they've had not just money and property, but education, positions, networking. You and I both know that, that phrase, it's not what you know, but it's who you know. Like, obviously people expect you to know something, but you do get in a lot of really better positions when you know someone of influence, or when you know someone that can give you an opportunity. That's a whole another conversation that I've had with people with less education, less experience than me, that have gotten higher opportunities than me, employment wise and stuff like that. But the whole perspective of that, like, when you take a group of people that didn't ever have anything to pass down, whether it's property, finances, or education, then you're going to have more of a group of people, or a race of people that are less wealthy. They're going to have less because there was nothing, it's like the idea of compound interest. Like, there was nothing to multiply.
Right.
There's nothing to share. And even if there was anything to share, there wasn't the education there. You know, one of my friends who I grew up with, I mean, we've been friends since we were 11 years old. And he just told me just the other day, like, his grandparents left him so much money that, you know, like, left not only him, he was a grandchild, like, left his parents money. Like, they don't really have to work. I mean, like, he doesn't, like, all his bills are taken care of. Like, I mean, he even talked about like supporting some of my projects and stuff like that because it's just nothing. Like every month he gets a substantial check. You know, it's insane to even think about.
Right.
And that's like from 2 generations ago. You know, that's from his grandparents.
Right.
Not more than that. You know, and so to me, it's just amazing, and it's amazing to me, like, because my grandparents were in a completely different situation. You know, my grandfather fought in the war. He was in the army, but then he also was like a truck driver.
Right.
You know, he drove trucks. So he did okay. I mean, he did well to support the family. My grandmother was a nurse. He had her stay home after a while to take care of their 6 children, and then the grandchildren. And then she became blind in her last 20 years of life, so she couldn't work anyway, you know, but it was just a very different reality.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, when you hear John's thoughts on all of this, do you think to yourself, he's a decent guy, he's well-intentioned, he's just kind of ignorant, and he probably needs someone that he respects to tell him, man, you really shouldn't make these black and white assessments, no pun intended, without you never have to walk in a black man's shoes. You never will. Is that how you kind of see it? I mean, and is that dangerous? Are his views dangerous?
I think that his views are unintentionally dangerous. I think that they can be offensive to people, but also if we're not doing the work to communicate value to people, then we can't expect it to change. I literally sat with a young teenage boy, 16 years old today. I asked him questions, and he literally he wasn't speaking up. He wasn't using his voice. He wasn't looking me in the eyes. He wasn't shaking my hand. All these different things. Can you imagine telling him all these, like the same perspective, and you know, this racial perspective or unintentional racial perspective, and then expecting him to somehow overcome the fact that you don't value his history or his path? You just want him to just by chance to overcome all of that and become a strong member of the society that makes a difference in the world.
Yeah.
When you haven't told him, you know, I literally had the conversation with him. I just met him, and I had the conversation with him. I said, hey, when I talk to you, I need you to look me in the eyes. I need you to shake my hand with confidence. I need you to articulate and answer every question that I ask you. I said, because your words and your voice has value. I don't know who told you that your voice does not have value, but it has value, and you need to believe it first. And then when you believe it, then the rest of the world is going to believe it. But I need you to always believe that your voice has value in this world.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be the conversation, not an unintentional, like, ignoring the fact that there are issues in the world.
Yeah. So last question about all of this. And I totally understand and even agree with the whole, come on, knock this stuff off with I have a black friend, so I'm not a racist or prejudiced. And John did not even allude to something like that. But I did, because I was somewhat uncomfortable with the stuff he was saying. I was like, we got to talk about Tyler Perry so people see that he's friends. And I understand people saying just because he's friends with Tyler Perry doesn't mean anything. But I was thinking about this today. Does it not mean anything? And the reason why I say that is let's say someone accuses me as being a racist. If they find out that there is a mutual close relationship between you and I, doesn't that at least clue them in on the fact that if you get to know Joey well, like Robbie has, he's obviously... Because I don't think you would be as close as you are to me. You wouldn't be that close with someone who you knew was a racist.
Right.
So when someone does have a legit close friendship with a black person, doesn't that mean something? Seems like it does.
I mean, it can, but you don't have any clue until you dive into that relationship. Because when you think about it, back in the day when you had housemaids, I mean, sometimes they were super close with their housemates.
That's a good point.
You know, like they were almost considered part of the family. They were kind of loved, but at the same time, they were also recognized as less than. They were recognized to stay in their place. And I think that sometimes, unintentionally, we can still communicate that within our friendships as well. That, you know, we're friends, but stay in your place.
Right.
You know, like, and I say that because sometimes even in relationships, I have one of my closest friends that I've had throughout life. I remember asking him one day, I was just like, hey, like, would you ever date a black girl? He's white. And he was like, no. And I'm like, what? You of all people? Because, like, I mean, we were so close. And, like, he, you know, he felt close. I mean, he, to this day, would never let anything bad happen to me. He's a cop as well. He ended up being a cop later in life. And I tell him, like, he's one of the good cops. Like, he's one that that really brings peace to my heart, that helps me, helps my perspective and mentality and stuff like that. But I straight up told him that he was off base. I'm like, you're going to literally say that that you're not racist, but you would never marry a black girl. Like, what is that? Like, have you ever even, like, delve into that? I have one other really close friend that did date a black girl. Like, he's white. He dated a black girl, was in love with this girl. Literally, like, he ended up having to move to another city. And she actually was working in that movie in that city part-time anyway. And, like, things were matching up. Things were making sense, like, for their future. His parents found out that she was black. And all of a sudden, my friend's world was rocked because his parents, who were also very close to me, like, told him that was wrong.
Wow.
Like, straight up told him that was wrong. They could not support it. They encouraged him out of it. He was devastated.
And that's one generation removed from us.
One generation removed, Christian, white family that loves this boy's black best friend, you know? And they didn't accept it. He was heartbroken. He for the first time in his life, had to kind of stand up, not against his parents, but, like, had to stand up and be strong for his opinion. And the woman that he loves sent them sermons. You know, like, some of the most respected preachers in the world that they would respect, you know, like, sent them sermons about it, sent them, you know, all these different things. And at the end of the day, they broke up, you know? And I think that, like, he probably wouldn't say that it was because of his parents, but obviously if this is going to be a divide with your family, there's more to consider there. Yeah. You know?
Yeah.
And yeah, so there's definitely perspective changes that need to happen. That's just like two little stories. I mean, I have tons of other friends. I mean, I have a friend who, when her parents, she's white, her parents met her boyfriend that she kept from them for a while. He told her, you know what I told you in high school, if you brought home a black guy, I would shoot him with my shotgun. That's what he told his daughter in college about her her black boyfriend. They had twin boys together. She's not allowed to go home with them. When she's at family functions at her hometown, the grandparents sit across the room from her. They don't touch the grandkids. They don't intermingle with the grandkids. They don't accept them because they're half black. And this is 2020.
Right.
You know,
right.
like people say it's 2020, but it's 2020.
Right.
You know? And the whole comment about the Confederate flag and, you know, all power to you. I mean, like, that's totally fine. Like, to fly a flag, that's one thing or whatever. Like, some people have grown past the offense and stuff like that. Like when it's like a personal thing, whatever. But, like, as far as, you can't say that symbols don't affect people.
Right.
Like, it'd be very disrespectful for me to take a swastika, you know, and wear swastikas on my clothes and to hang out with some of my Jewish best friends.
Right.
You know?
But the Confederate flag doesn't mean that. Oh, but to some people, that's what it symbolizes. Yeah. And including white people who fly it proudly, and it is a sign of white supremacy.
Oh, absolutely.
That's not all white people.
College of Charleston, they just had a group of white kids that sent this like viral video. I think they were waving Confederate flag or something like that. Like they were going through, I don't know if it was a plantation here in Charleston, making some very offensive racial remarks. I mean, they had to do all these, like, they did all these rallies on campus, just kind of responding to this behavior. It just was crazy. And like things like that happen like that in Charleston all the time. I mean, I play weddings in Charleston. One of the wedding venues that I hate playing at is Boone Hall. Why? Because they still have, you know, slave quarters up. They still have all these monuments up, and people are celebrating and having weddings there. No black people are having weddings there, I can tell you that.
Right.
But people are flying into town to have weddings in these places, and I am meant to dress up really nicely and to sing their special songs so that they can have their good night. You know, it feels kind of weird.
It really is a crazy thing in Charleston.
It is a crazy thing. And I do have friends that aren't from Charleston that refuse to come down and do weddings. If they get weddings in Charleston, they just say, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, because, I mean, when you hear the word plantation in Charleston, almost all the time it's such beautiful. It is a beautiful plantation. Right. And yeah, if you want to look at it by just appearance, yeah, it's beautiful. Right. But then when you think, go back 200 years, what's this place like? Right. Unbelievable. Right.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
I mean, the word honestly was desensitized to me at a young age.
Right. Oh, I was definitely. This whole thing with plantations didn't occur to me until like 5 years ago.
Same.
5 years ago.
Yeah. Like, it just was, it's crazy because I went on field trips to these places, like, you know, as a young kid or whatever, but it literally was just like this positive experience, bring your lunch, you know, and it's just like, okay, well, you know, like when you think plantation, you're thinking as a Charleston native, you're thinking, okay, field trip, you know, like day to get out of school or whatever, but like it wasn't necessarily, like we don't treat them historically like they are anymore. Like if I was to go into, I mean, there's still some churches that have shackles on the ground in the balcony, like in the floors of the balcony where like African Americans had to be chained down if they were ever to be in a church service.
They still have them?
Oh yeah. They're in some places now. You know, it's just like, it's just insane.
Wow.
Like why do we preserve these things?
Right.
Like,
What about preserving monuments? Well, let me put it this way. So why, Robbie, why the hell do y'all get a whole month, man? February, that pisses me off. I'm just kidding.
I mean, have you seen us play basketball? Have you heard us sing? I'm just playing.
It's funny. Chris Rock says how February is the shortest month and it's the coldest month, and that's what y'all give us. Oh, y'all trying to pick some climate where we can't throw a parade. But what just occurred to me too is this, and this is just funny. I don't think anything's intentional. At least I don't think so. Right. But we're gonna throw in President's Day, and y'all have got to celebrate this during Black History Month.
It better not be Obama.
I mean, because before 2008, it's like we're celebrating President's Day in February, and oh yeah, it's a bunch of white presidents. Right. But how do you feel when George Washington is celebrated as a hero, a founding father, and I mean monuments in his name?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we can celebrate people, but we can also acknowledge when they were wrong, you know? And I think also with history, the hard part about history is that we can have an opinion based off of our variables today and forget about what the variables were back then. You know, so like when you talk about your grandfather, like his variables were very, very different from mine, you know? Like I am probably way more outspoken than some older black people just because they were taught to have a lot of respect when talking about people. Like their perspective of people were just, of white people, I would say, was just so different than it is for mine. Like I view it in a more of an equality perspective than they did even, you know? And so back with you know, George Washington and, you know, all these figures, like the factors were just so different back then. So that doesn't mean that all their actions were right, but at the same time, like that doesn't mean that they didn't do anything that that was worth celebrating.
Right.
So
yeah. I tend to, first I want to be first and foremost, I want to hear from Black people and how they feel about it. But I tend to think, for example, my grandma, who was married to my grandpa, if I, like when she died, if I had the same approach to race that she did when she died, you could say, Joey, you're a racist.
Right.
But if you look at her and how far she has come since her inherited cultural posture
Right.
and how much she changed over the course of 80 years, you would be like, wow, that's beautiful that you came this far.
Right.
And so I look at someone like George Washington and people in history, and it's not excusable, but you do have to factor in that ever since he was a young kid, he was taught
Right.
this is normal. Black people aren't humans.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's how he was
Right.
he was raised. And so,
And you think about it, like even in biblical times, like slavery was a part of society. Like it was a part of how life was. But when you look at the responses of Jesus, like he actually depicted how you were to treat your slaves. Like it wasn't treating them like property. It was actually treating them with respect and giving them what they deserve. It was more of treating them like an employee, honoring them for the work that they have done, inviting them in, all those things, and it actually describes a relationship between a slave and a slave's master. Like the slave master, healthy slave to slave master, was that he had respect for his master. The same way that if someone were, for example, like say that, I don't know why I can't think of artists right now, but like Chris Tomlin or Justin Bieber. Let's go with Justin Bieber. So say that Justin Bieber just like heard a video of me singing and he was just like, oh my gosh, this guy is amazing. And all he needs is an opportunity for his voice to be heard. And, like people, I believe that he would do some good work and people would love him and, he can get his art out there and stuff like that. Like, I think that I personally would have respect for Justin Bieber and I would honor him because he gave me an opportunity. He opened the door. He saw value in me. He saw my contribution and rewarded that, and so I had respect for him, for someone who went before me, and so a lot of times with slavery in the past, masters of homes would bring in people, they had land, they had food. And so when you were a slave and you didn't have those things, you would go and you would work for a family and you would be appreciative. Like you'd be appreciative because all of a sudden you have land, you have food over your or a roof over your head, you've got food and you're doing work for someone, but it's also supporting your family. Right. So there was kind of this respect there, but human nature actually causes us to disrespect them and to treat them like property and to treat them like, I'm deserving of you to do every single thing for me because I'm giving you this opportunity. Like it's a tainted and twisted view of it.
Yeah, for sure. We'll put in the show notes how people can track you down for your music and that sort of thing. That'd be cool for people to be able to access. I'll close with telling you something I think you'll get a kick out of. You when you mentioned honky and cracker, it reminded me. So my last 2 years of teaching, I literally had class. I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade math, and it was a super small school, pretty much 97% black. I mean, It was an occasional white or Hispanic kid. And so over the course of the year, I mean, I got really close to these kids, and I have a pretty good balance of being able to have really good discipline and then let the friendships begin. Let's have fun and everything. Right. And so there'd be times, and I would just do it in random times. Like I would write something on the board and one of the kids would say like, Mr. S, you forgot to do blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, oh man, I'm just a dumb cracker or something. And they'd be like, no, you can't say that. You can't say that. Like it made them so uncomfortable.
I can see jaws dropped all over the room.
Well, Robbie, thanks, man. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate you.